Okay guys, we're picking up right where we left off on the last video. We're talking about reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule, and we said in the last video that by the time the tubular fluid reaches the distal convoluted tubule, we've got about 80 to 85% of it reabsorbed back into the blood. So when we get to the distal convoluted tubule, now we get a chance to make some final alterations to the blood so we can control the composition of the urine. So we'll have in the distal convoluted tubule, DCT, we'll have selective reabsorption and also we'll have secretion. Now, the tubular cells in the distal convoluted tubule will actively transport out sodium and chloride ions out of the tubular fluid into the peritubular fluid. This is going to help us conserve ions and help maintain homeostasis in the blood in terms of ion concentration. We also see reabsorption of calcium ions in this part of the nephron. Now, the movement of ions is basically controlled by a hormone called aldosterone. Well, there's another one that has an effect as well. And aldosterone is produced in the adrenal cortex. And you guys can remember the adrenal glands just sit right on top of the kidneys. Now, the main role in the DCT is secretion. Okay, and remember, secretion is the reverse of absorption. So when we're secreting things, we're not taking fluid out of the nephron back into the blood. We're taking stuff from the blood or the peritubular fluid and adding it back into the nephron. Now, when we do that, by secreting stuff inside of the tubular fluid, it's going to become part of the urine. So it's the stuff that's going to be excreted. Okay, so secretion is adding things back in that our body doesn't necessarily need. So that we can get rid of it. So that generally happens when we have ions or compounds in our body fluids that have too high a concentration. If you've ever taken a multivitamin, some of those multivitamins can have 1,000% of the vitamin B that you need for a normal healthy metabolism. So your body recognizes that, and at the kidneys, that extra vitamin B is secreted from the peritubular fluid into the nephron, and then it's excreted through the urine. So if you're taking a multivitamin has a high vitamin B, there's a good chance your urine is going to be a really bright yellow color, because that's sometimes what vitamin B in the urine looks like. So this idea of secretion, this is the main function of the distal convoluted tubule, and remember, it's the opposite of reabsorption. Now, by the time we get to the end of the distal convoluted tubule, 90 to 95% of the filtered solutes and the water have been reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. Okay, so first we filter almost everything out, and then we slowly bring it back into the blood again. So it gives us a very efficient way to filter out our blood and then control the composition of our peritubular or our interstitial fluid, as well as the composition of our blood. Now, from the DCT, those are going to empty into several nephrons are going to empty into the collecting ducts. So the collecting ducts are going to receive tubular fluid from a lot of different nephrons, and they're going to carry that away to the renal sinus. So in the collecting ducts, we've got 4 of these different functions that happen, and they all basically boil down to maintaining the composition of the bodily fluids and maintaining the composition of the urine. So the collecting ducts control the amount of water and solute that are eliminated in the urine. They also, by controlling the amount of water, they're controlling urine volume and the concentration. Some ions and some solutes can be reabsorbed in a collecting duct. So sodium, bicarbonate, and urea can be reabsorbed if the body so needs it. And by doing all this stuff, they can control the body fluid pH by either secreting or absorbing hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. So this is the main functions that occur in the collecting tubules. Now, the amount of water and solute loss that occurs at the collecting ducts is regulated by 2 different hormones. Okay, the first one is antidiuretic hormone, and this one's produced in the pituitary gland, and it's secreted in a response to a rise in blood electrolytes. Okay, so when blood electrolytes get high, the pituitary gland releases antidiuretic hormone, and the idea behind that is to prevent the loss of water, so we don't have a very dilute urine and we lose a lot of water in the urine. Now, another hormone that has an effect on the collecting tubules is aldosterone, which we mentioned earlier. Aldosterone is produced in the adrenal glands, and it's more specific. It's secreted in response to a drop in sodium. So if sodium in your blood goes down, aldosterone is secreted, and it affects the cells of the collecting ducts, and it acts to prevent the loss of sodium so that we don't lose sodium ions in our urine. So two hormones that help fine-tune the composition of the bodily fluid as well as the urine. Now, urine volume and concentration are basically regulated by controlling how much water we reabsorb or how much we allow to be excreted. Most of the water that is filtered out at the glomerulus is reabsorbed by the time it passes through the proximal convoluted tubule and the descending loop of Henle. So those are the two places where most water reabsorption will occur. Now, the precise control of water loss is going to be regulated by that hormone, the antidiuretic hormone. Okay, the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts are both impermeable to water. Okay, so normally water can't pass through those cells normally because they're impermeable. Now, if there's the presence of ADH, that causes these little tiny water columns or water channels to appear, and that will allow water to pass through the membranes of the DCT as well as the collecting ducts. So by those channels appearing, what's going to happen is water can move from the intertubular fluid back into the body circulation or back into the peritubular fluid. So it's not lost in the urine. Now, our body will continuously secrete low levels of ADH, and that's a natural defense mechanism so that we don't lose too much water in our urine. But as you guys know, if there is a rise in electrolytes, ADH gets released from the pituitary. So what we'll see here, if we look in the first picture here in A, we'll see this is normal. No ADH is present here. The little particles in our blood are showing the concentration of particles, solutes, in the peritubular fluid, and this represents basically a normal situation. So if we looked at the urine from this patient, we'd see that it's a large amount of very dilute urine. Now, if there's an increase in solutes, electrolytes, what's going to happen is we're going to have an increase in ADH. So ADH is going to be released, and it's going to have an effect on the DCT as well as the collecting tubules right here. So you can see here a lot more electrolytes, a lot more little particles present in the blood, or in the tubular fluid, sorry. That opens up those water channels, and water will flow from the urine, from the tubular fluid back into the peritubular fluid or into the circulation. So this allows us to save water. Now, if we looked at this urine sample from this patient, what we'd find is a relatively small volume of urine, but it would be very concentrated, so it would be very dark in color, compared to the first patient that had lots of urine, but it was very pale or almost hardly had any color at all. So that's the difference between the presence of ADH and the absence of ADH. Now, the other hormone we talked about, the aldosterone, that's secreted by the adrenal gland, and that's also going to cause, that's going to cause cells in the collecting ducts to reabsorb more sodium and chloride. As a result of moving sodium and chloride, of course, water is going to move back into the blood. So it's another way that we will have water retained in the body and produce more concentrated urine. Another thing that aldosterone does is it secretes potassium ions and hydrogen ions into the tubular fluid. So we will, as a result of saving the sodium and the chloride and the water, we'll lose some potassium and hydrogen ions to the tubular fluid. So as a result, it'll be lost through the urine. So if aldosterone is present, we'll see more water retained in the body, and that'll result in a concentrated urine with a smaller volume. So this is what a normal person produces on a healthy adult, on a normal day, will produce around 1.4 liters of urine. Okay, so that's what's filtered out from our kidneys. That's what our body uses up or doesn't need, and as a result, it gets excreted through the kidneys. And if you look up here, you can see some of the composition. Most of what's excreted is urea. Then you'll see chloride ions, sodium ions, potassium ions, creatinine, bicarbonate ions, and finally uric acid. Now, this is what the chemical composition is going to be. Most of this is going to be made up of just water. So the little tiny green spot in the bottom of the beaker here, this is what this is made up of, and the rest of that is going to be water that we've excreted. Now, the collecting system, collecting tubules, is an important site for controlling the body fluid pH. Because as we all talked about, enzyme function and stuff like that, it needs to have a narrow range of pH, so it's important to maintain body fluid at a constant level. If the pH of the peritubular fluid gets too acidic, what will happen is hydrogen ions, which are what basically make stuff acidic or less acidic basic, are pumped into the tubular fluid, and bicarbonate ions, which are higher pH, would be reabsorbed. And as a result of that shift, you're going to see the body or peritubular fluid pH increase, so it'll go a little bit more basic, and then you'll see the urine become slightly acidic. Okay, so our body is constantly making these fine-tuning mechanisms in order to control the pH of our bodily fluid and urine. Now, if the peritubular fluid gets too basic, the opposite, what will happen is those bicarbonate ions, they will be secreted into the tubular fluid, and that'll cause hydrogen ions to be pumped back into the peritubular fluid. So it's a switcheroo from what we've seen in the last situation. When that happens, our peritubular or our body fluid is going to decrease, become a little bit more acidic, and then the pH of the urine is going to be a little bit more basic, or the pH is going to go up. These type of fine-tuning happens all the time in order to maintain that constant environment, the homeostasis of the blood and the body fluids.